Good morning. Good morning. Happy to see you all here, full house. We are very excited. We have a very intensive day today, and we are happy to start with our first panel. And I will just pass on the floor to Mike Chobani from Blockchain Hub, who kindly sponsored this panel. So the floor is yours, Mike.
Welcome to very first Ukraine House Davos and the very first blockchain discussion in the very first Ukraine House Davos. So thank you for coming. We have a great team of panelists today. Today the aim of this discussion is not to promote something, is rather to get the experience from the from Switzerland, from US, and it will be just the global perspective, because I know all of you are traveling a lot. So I know some of you have been to Seoul recently. You travel a lot, so we're going to have the global perspective of what's happening with the blockchain, what's happening with the crypto. We're not afraid to say word Bitcoin here, so feel free to ask questions about cryptocurrencies. And if you don't mind, we're going to start. So quick introduction about me. I'm Michael Chobani, founder of the co-founder of the Blockchain Hub. I am the founder of the community, blockchain and crypto community. At the time, it was just the Bitcoin community. It was 2014, and from that we started and developing the community. Now I run the exchange. I do a lot of close to government things. I have the cryptomats and so on. And now we're launching the Blockchain Hub, which is the physical presence of where companies work, blockchain companies, obviously, where people can come and ask questions and so on. So it's like physical concentration of the community right now. And if you don't mind, we're going to start with the self-introduction, because I could say something which I read on the internet, something I know personally from you, but it would be ideal if you can self-introduce yourself. Let's start with Don, please.
Thank you. I'm Don Tapscott, and I founded the Blockchain Research Institute. It's based in Toronto. I've been writing about the digital age for a long time. My first book was 1981 about the internet. My mother bought most of the copies of that book. It was sort of like a study in bad timing. Unbelievably, everyone said you're wrong, that regular people will never use computers and they will not become a communications tool. And the reason that I was wrong is because managers and professionals will never learn to type. That's what people said back then. Anyway, flash forward a number of years. I wrote a book, it was the first bestseller about the web in 1994, called The Digital Economy. And I was asked to write the 20th anniversary edition. So I had to think about, if that's been the last 20 years, what's the next 20 going to bring? And I was quite interested in cryptocurrencies, and I started understanding that while the currencies are important, and they are, they're a new asset class, they're a way of achieving consensus on some blockchains, and a non-fiat currency does have some interesting use cases, for example, around remittances. But to me, the real pony here and the real opportunity is the underlying blockchain technology. And I began working with my son Alex, who was an investment banker, and we came to the conclusion that blockchain is not just some distributed ledger that makes crypto work. It represents the second era of the internet. That we've had an internet of information for 40 years, and now we're getting an internet of value, or anything of value, from money to stocks to votes to music, intellectual property, identity, carbon credits, you name it, can be managed, transacted in a secure and confidential way. And where trust is not achieved by a big middleman, it's achieved by cryptography and by collaboration and by some clever code, which is why we call it the trust protocol. So that's kind of like my background. So we wrote the book Blockchain Revolution, and my timing has not always been good, but it was pretty good with this one. It's still, after 18 months, the best-selling book about blockchain. And I'll tell you one funny thing that I just found out, because the book is actually selling better now than when it first came out. that the ultimate review for an author is the New York Review of Books. You get in there and you've made it. And we didn't get into the New York Review of Books until last week, almost 20 months after this book came out. There's a huge feature about blockchain based on our books. So there you go.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
that was a long introduction.
Mark, if you don't mind, next, I know you're heavily involved into the crypto. You're an entrepreneur, you're an investor. I know you contact a lot of my comrades back from Ukraine. So please, self-introduce yourself.
Good morning, everybody. Mr. Mike on, otherwise I just scream. I think it's on, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Mark. I'm originally a tech entrepreneur, founded my first company in 1999. And as you just said, it feels a little bit similar today in the whole blockchain crypto space, but I think it will be even more extreme. So after I co-founded and exited 2 own companies, I moved into the investment space. So since 2010, I'm mainly investing in fintech companies. Also back then, fintech was not such a hot topic. And I'm in crypto since 2012. And yeah, I have quite a few hats. Among others, we also co-organized the conference you might have heard in St. Moritz, the Crypto Finance Conference. So we have roughly 40 people from our conference now walking around here in Davos. And I think what really fascinated me is that we had a few really very big traditional investors from all over the world, and they're moving all into crypto. So it's not just the taxi driver and the nanny trading crypto, because when you read the press, you think it's just about these guys, which is fine. But from my perspective, I see now a lot of very experienced guys. They were already very successful in the hedge fund world, in the traditional private equity world. And I think we're now exactly at the tipping point. So perhaps we were all a little bit ahead of the curve, but I think we will see a tremendous development in the next few months. So that's a little bit from my side.
Thank you. John, you're next. I know you have a background in classical banking, which is not really the key topic in the crypto anarchist community. So please tell us how you switched from core banking to crypto and fintech.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Michael. Yeah, I was going to start at exactly that point. I'm the traditional finance guy probably here on the panel. I'm also a fellow Canadian with Don, Canadian and British. I left my home country after an early start in my career in wealth management quite a few years ago, and I went to study for an MBA at Oxford. And coming out of that, we were in the middle of the aftermath of the financial crisis, and I had an opportunity to go to Switzerland with Credit Suisse. And not many people were looking at that opportunity at the moment. The end of banking secrecy was clear. The financial crisis had upended financial centers around the world, and it really wasn't clear what the value proposition for Switzerland was going to be going forward. And that was what really intrigued me. I thought, you know, everybody else is fleeing. This is a great country, and it's got strong fundamentals for the future. Clearly, there's an opportunity to be part of the change. I didn't know that was going to be things like crypto and fintech, but I dove into the middle of it and could see that really digitization and technology was going to be the way of the future. So I started actually a lot like Michael did with crypto in the Ukraine to say, look, this is a community issue. We want to build a community here and connect people like Mark and the others that are acting on that. And yeah, it's grown quite a long way. It's now called the Swiss Finance and Technology Association. So we're the fintech hub for Switzerland and connected quite well internationally. And then in parallel to that, I've left Credit Suisse now, and I run a fledgling venture builder called Elliott Capital. And what we're in the midst of doing right now is really, actually, frankly, painting the broader picture. I think crypto has really been fantastic at inspiring people about innovation in financial services, especially in a place like Switzerland, where perhaps for a number of generations things had become very traditional. But we also think there's a much broader topic that can be explored within Switzerland, particularly around wealth management and insurance and some of those core strengths that we're really a world leader in.
Thank you. Which can we fix this? So, which brings me to the key question. We have a topic which is called the Ukraine as a new crypto haven on the world map. Right now, the whole community is just talking about Switzerland, sometimes Korea, but not recently, Japan, and US, but very limited due to SEC. So my question is, what do you think is the what do you think the key components are for this crypto haven? Is it regulation, deregulation? Is it understanding national bank or wherever the regulator is? Or is it just the financial authorities, or it has to be the will of the president, like, for example, opposite to Ukraine House, we have Russia, where everything is centralized and they have a word from the president that everything has to be digital economy. Now they're all running for the digital economy. No one actually understands what it is. So what's the source? What do you think? What's the key source to make this, Cryptohaven pudding?
Well, I was asked Alex and I were asked by the Canadian government to explore the idea that could this be centered in Canada. And we took a look at it. The first conclusion was this will not be based in Silicon Valley. And it's basically leaders of old paradigms have great difficulty embracing the new. And so we looked at Canada's sort of strengths, and that's gives a taxonomy and a framework to think about this problem. So, and here's the good news. Canada has 5 banks, not 95, and that means that they have a chance to get together and actually reinvent the payment system, and they're moving nicely in that direction. We have the 2 biggest incubators in North America. Mars alone has 1.9 and hundreds of companies. We have a massive blockchain community. A lot of it's on Ethereum. Vitalik Buterin is from Toronto. And there's a big community around that. We've got great universities with good computer science, University of Waterloo. We are the center of thought leadership in the world with the Blockchain Research Institute. We're doing 75 projects on the strategic impact of blockchain. And we've got pretty good government support and comprehension. The federal government has a $900 million supercluster plan, and of the 6 finalists, for that, 6 of the 10 finalists have a big blockchain component to that. And then we've got good support from the Bank of Canada, the federal government, the Ontario government, and the City of Toronto are all members of our Blockchain Research Institute. The regulatory environment is not the best, but it's pretty good. It's not like, say, Korea or China. And regulation, I don't think it's the only factor, but it is an absolutely necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition.
We can discuss
but
regulation.
Yeah,
in more
but
detail.
yeah, okay, but it's a required condition. And Canada used to have a brain drain, especially around sort of Series A type funding, where maybe you could get some venture capital, you get a company, you grow to 15 million revenue, you want to raise 20 million, and Sequoia says, well, you're going to have to move to the valley to do that. But now, because of ICOs, you don't have to, so that's a big thing. And thanks to Donald Trump, we also have a brain gain, not a brain drain like we used to have, because a lot of smart people in the US are moving back to Canada. Canadians who've gone to the US, and also a lot of US people are moving to Canada because it's a good environment to raise a family and stuff like that. So those are the kinds of criteria that we looked at. Now, Canada has some deficiencies as well, and I think the jury is out on this one. And there may not be one Silicon Valley like there was for the first era of the internet. There may be multiple centers.
Thank you. Thank you. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I would say, let's say on a high level, like always, you need passionate entrepreneurs. So that's like the foundation of everything. And that could literally happen every year. And I mean, now with the new way of raising money, it can literally also happen all over the world without having a connection to big money from the Silicon Valley, which is great. Honestly, I think, I mean, regulation, as a liberal person, especially in Switzerland, so the less the government cares, the better it is for entrepreneurs. But that's easy said. I mean, last week we had the Swiss Federal Councillor at our conference, and he announced the term Crypto Nation Switzerland. So Switzerland now really has a bold statement from top that we want to move into this direction, which is great. But at the end, I would say, I mean, it's funny that in a completely decentralized and global business like the blockchain business, we talk about national regulation, which is completely silly, right? I mean, you can, at least as a government, try to somehow regulate it and have some national borders, but on the long run, it's a global issue. So that's why, that's one of my fears, honestly, especially in the cryptocurrency space. We have the G20 sitting together in a few weeks from now, and I'm not quite sure what they want to decide, but at least that would be, from my side, the only place where regulation or hopefully some entrepreneur-friendly guidelines will be made.
Well, to be honest, the key question. Sorry, John, I'm getting the word. Yeah, the key question about regulation is not regulating the crypto, is regulating actually the banks or the financial partners who eventually give you access from fiat to crypto. Because I mean, what can you regulate in Bitcoin or Ethereum? Nothing. That's the whole point. It's that
They might want to regulate some things, though, so that might be one of the changes that's required. I think what I wanted to add to the discussion, picking up the point that Vitalik spends some of his time in Toronto and quite a lot in Zug as well in the Crypto Valley, I think the commonality that you've seen between Canada and Switzerland is strong fundamentals. These are economies that are well-performing, they're well-managed, and I think that core fundamental of stability and reliability is what has allowed countries like that to really leap ahead. I think if you're honest about it, what has really given Switzerland a leg up is a combination of its tax regime and also its regulatory stance. It's very, let's say they're very pragmatic about approaching new things. They want to understand them before they react quickly. That's something that you can't hold on to forever, as we saw with the banking secrecy and the tax haven that Switzerland used to enjoy. At a certain point, the regulatory topic isn't just national, it's international. And I think actually for the long term, to figure this out, you really do have to figure out how it's going to connect to those types of stakeholders. Otherwise, they're going to be coming after you with regulation.
Okay, I'm going to ask the straightforward question. What plan of action should be taken for country to become the crypto haven? For example, you're the Prime Minister of Canada or President of USA. What kind of plan of action would you take to do it for the country? Choose the country, any country.
Well,
be a president.
I've talked to the Prime Minister of Canada about this, actually, and we have proposed a bunch of things, okay? First of all, don't screw it up with bad regulation, okay? ICOs, let's be clear. If the token that you're selling represents a share in a company, that's called a security. Looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it ought to fall under securities legislation. But most tokens are not. They're utilities. They represent, or something else, a currency, a carbon credit, a loyalty point, a future in some software, a monetization of a supply chain or something like that. And hands off those. You don't want to touch those. Now there's a gray area, but you need regulators to err on the side of letting this thing grow and evolve. And then there's a question of tax regulation too. Like how do you treat all this stuff? And they're extreme.
So how would you treat it? I'm sorry for interrupting.
How would I?
Yeah. Because I need this video to show to my government. Yeah.
Well, the extremes are that this is just a currency. If you own some US dollars and the dollar goes up, you shouldn't have to pay tax on that. The other extreme is, and I've had this because I went on a couple of advisory boards and I received some options to purchase tokens. I had tax lawyers telling me, you need to get a valuator to determine the future value of those tokens and pay tax on it right now. And I said, you can't be serious. And then in the middle is sort of this more reasonable point of view that says, you know, if you turn this into a fiat currency, it's a big capital gain. If you bought it at this and it goes up to that, that probably is a reasonable kind of point of view. So I'm sorry, that was your last question. I didn't answer the first one, but I don't want to do all the talking.
We got it. Thank you.
I think
What's your take on it?
I think you touched on a great point, though. Speaking with Prime Minister Trudeau is a great starting point. I think also what we see here today from the Ukraine and what Marc has mentioned last week from Switzerland, you need to have leadership from the top. You need to put this as a priority, and then there's things that fall out from that, sorting out regulations, sorting out education, reskilling people. There's a number of things that fall under that once you set the priority.
Yeah, and honestly, I would say, I mean, let's take Uber. You have two different approaches. You can say we have now quite outdated laws, how we want to treat taxis, and now you have a disruptor like Uber. and is changing the game, so you try to somehow make Uber fitting into the existing, mostly outdated taxi business. Or you do the opposite, what happens in quite a few countries now. You look at the status quo, you look at the technology, and a lot of these new cases, they're completely new, so the laws and regulation were made before these new players entered the game. And you just do a review and decide, are these existing laws and regulations really how they should be? And starting from there, and I think that's the same with the whole crypto asset space, we should define what really makes sense. I think no serious guy in the space is about, wants to have money laundering or any other unserious activities, but I think just the existing status quo, how it is, and that's why the government really fears these new developments. I mean, it's just outdated, honestly.
Excellent thing that I think we bump into with a lot of this is how do you adapt? And it's interesting when you're at a place like Davos that brings together corporates and governments, they're not traditionally known for being able to adapt quickly when things accelerate. And that's a big macro trend now. Everything's happening quicker. And what I see a lot in Switzerland is whether it's the government or the corporates, they're used to a little bit of a different pace of change. And that's really what we rely on to bring that stability. And things like crypto and all these new innovations really do challenge that process. So how do we adapt as organizations, as governments, as society to these new types of disruptions popping up so that we don't have, let's say, a bubble that bursts and we actually do harness this effectively?
Yeah, I mean, you want to create the conditions whereby this can happen and grow quickly. And in the world, there are very different attitudes. Like I was in a country, I won't mention where, and they said, we want to become the innovation center of our region. This is a country that did not have limited liability corporations, there was no venture capital in this country. There was no early stage the banks wouldn't lend money to companies. The universities weren't teaching anything to do with entrepreneurship or technology. And if you write a check and it bounces, you go to jail and there's no recourse. So these are not the conditions that are going to help you build innovation and entrepreneurship. If I was the prime minister of any country, the president, I would launch a digital economy commission. And I would bring in people like you guys. I would bring in bankers. I would bring in academics and civil society people and business leaders and so on, and let them go at it and get exposure to all the leading thinkers in the world and come up with a national strategy that addresses all the big issues. Regulation. How are we going to ensure that we have infrastructure? How do we achieve awakening in our country? What big projects might we actually fund in this country? How does government become a model user? That's the first thing governments can do, is start to use blockchain, because there are profound opportunities to change the whole architecture of governments and the sort of deep structure of how we orchestrate capability to create public value. How do we get our universities and schools teaching this stuff? What does it mean for law enforcement? I mean, smart law enforcement people love crypto. You know, you see the video by Catherine Kahn, a federal prosecutor in the U.S. It's a TEDx video. She talks about how the prosecutors are using Bitcoin to catch the bad guys. They love it way better than cash. And cash is the foundation of organized crime and the drug industry and everything else bad that happens in the world. At least with crypto, you may have anonymous transactions, but you have metadata, and you can start to see weird things that are happening. So every country needs a strategy, really, to deal with this. And the way to achieve that is not for some government to dictate it. It's for it to come bottom up through a vast national consultative process.
Excellent.
I think that's a very good point. And in Switzerland, we exactly have, it's called the Blockchain Task Force. I'm the honored to be involved there as well, and I think it was just announced 2 weeks ago.
Can you explain what it is?
I mean, at the end, it's exactly what Don just mentioned.
So it's an association of some sort?
It's not an association. It's a group of roughly 20, 30 people.
Think tank.
And it's also not a think tank. You have entrepreneurs, exactly what you said. You have investors, you have lawyers, you have government people. So you have literally everybody which is somehow relevant to cover the space, and we're advising, or let's say the outcome of this task force goes directly to the 2 of our 7 federal councillors. And I think in April we will have the first results out of this task force. And honestly, we have a few people there completely against crypto currencies, crypto assets, the whole crypto ecosystem. But that's great because we have a dialogue, right? I mean, it's not just heading into one direction. It's really a very intense discussion, and hopefully we find some outcomes which go directly to the government, and they hopefully implement it.
Well, creating a change is, when we talk about the blockchain in tax laws, in all kind of laws which already exist in the big countries, is quite a challenge. What do you think of a strategy of doing it like in a small, semi-isolated area like a sandbox? So you take a region and you say, okay, we're going to test the blockchain technology here. So we're going to test the registry on a blockchain. We're going to test, I don't know, maybe cryptocurrencies, national cryptocurrencies, and so on, so on. What do you think of these tactics? Does it have a future, or we should just take the whole country and regulate the whole country at once? John, let's start with you.
I think the sandbox idea obviously has a number of merits, especially where there's places that it has a complete ecosystem that you can really test within, whether it's a small country. You know, Singapore, for example, is doing a lot of things almost on a national scale because it's so small it can experiment like that. Hong Kong, yeah, obviously within the greater China. So that's obviously very nice. I think Switzerland has been a bit of a petri dish for a lot of this stuff as well. So having an economy that can provide a testing environment is great. And obviously you see regulators and other commercial groups creating these types of labs where you can see what starts to happen. Does it really work? Does this create the types of benefits that we're expecting it to? And you know, as you say, there are challengers. Not everything comes out to prove that blockchain will be the answer, but I think it's a very effective way to sort through those outcomes.
What do you think, Mark? Is it too good example of the sandbox?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like I said in the beginning, we can now start somewhere, but at the end you can't stop it. I mean, it's like if you say, let's try to take this internet and just use it in this room. I mean, that's possible if we cut off the connection everywhere else, but it's just unstoppable. And I think that's the same way, as you said, it's a digitization of values. So it's difficult to stop. But I would say, honestly, I mean, the best use case for blockchain, or one of the best use cases, is the government. And I think, I mean, the government is about trust, right? And I don't need a notary guy putting some stamps on a paper. I don't need other people from the government just to have the formal approval because it's some government institution in between. So that's why, and that's perhaps also a threat for certain governmental institutions. I mean, the blockchain, the trust of the whole blockchain ecosystem, at the end could replace quite a few of the functions of a government, which I personally think is great.
Well, we started off in Ukraine with the testing the land registry on the blockchain. So what's your take? Where should the country start? Because it's a scary topic for the government officials, you know, implement the blockchain. Everything would be, you know, visible to everyone. You can audit it really easily. There is nothing to hide. So where would you start, Dan? Don, sorry, I'm sorry, Dan. I always want to call you Dan, I'm sorry.
Everybody does that. Well, there are a whole bunch of great sort of easy killer apps in government. Land titles, beautiful. Anything where government supply chains, anything where you need to know the provenance. Supply chains are a $64 trillion industry, and they will move to blockchain. Governments have the biggest supply chains in the world, actually. And governments are also the biggest owner of things. So the Internet of Things needs a ledger of things. So there's all kinds of opportunities there to start to implement stuff. They're real simple ones, like just setting up a company. We did a project in Canada. To create a restaurant in Toronto, you need 64 permits. And so we started talking about how could we transform that, and it takes like 2 years or something. It's ridiculous. So how could blockchain transform something like that? I think that there are also, well, the killer app, of course, and this may determine which country actually emerges as the leader, is which country will be first to move its fiat currency onto a blockchain.
That'll be the end question for us, but keep it a bit.
But the country that does that is going to blow the minds of every government leader in the entire world. And of course, it will happen. It has to happen. If you're a central banker, imagine if you had a digital fiat currency, just what kind of unbelievable power that would give. You want to change the inflation rate, you don't wait months to find out what happens. You could have great transparency into what people are doing. You have a crisis, rather than giving a bunch of money to bankers and hoping that they do something with it, like 2008, you could helicopter drop money onto the mobile devices of certain groups of people, like the poorest people or something like that. You could have awesome transparency in your monetary system. You could have a lighter touch on regulation, using transparency as a force for controlling things rather than regulate. You know the idea. If you're going to be naked, fitness is no longer optional. You know, if you're going to be naked, you got to get buff, basically. And that was a line from a very good book I wrote 15 years ago that my mother did buy many of the copies of. So that's a really big one. And then I'm really excited about seeing what are the first governments to move towards blockchain for democracy. And that's a whole, I don't know if you want to talk about that, but that's a whole juicy separate
We love that topic, but
Yeah.
since we already started
Yeah.
with the national cryptocurrencies, you said the benefits, which are right, but there is also a drawback. Government will control absolutely everything, and they'll kill the privacy. They can at the switch they can shut down anyone's account, which is a huge challenge. I mean, for I'm not saying like all the criminal activities. I'm saying about politician, you need to shut him down. You just shut down his account, and that's it.
Look at
He's
the
broke.
evolution of the internet now in the US and the great debate about net neutrality. You can see directly how controlling the infrastructure can be abused. So yeah, 20 years later, where will we be? Maybe 10 years.
Well, that's another reason to have an advisory process like this. So you think through these issues and you get a national consensus and agreement that if we're going to move in this direction, we also need to have all kinds of protections for citizens. And it's only, it's only public awareness. This is all about the relationship of forces between people in power and everybody else, which is why what you're doing in Switzerland is awesome, and it really shows the way forward. When that report's published, you should run that baby up the flagpole and tell the whole world about it.
I think one reason, and that's always like the foundation. I mean, in Switzerland, we are, I think, the most decentralized country because we have this direct democracy, and we have the towns voting for certain. I mean, we can literally vote about everything. Do you want to build a new hall for, I don't know, for a school? And if it reaches a certain budget, people literally vote in favor or against it. So that's already quite, I mean, it's not blockchain based yet, but it's already quite a similar idea. And I think that's why there are other countries, you all know, which are perhaps less open to this new decentralized way, because literally you're destroying the whole political system.
Thank you. One more question. This house is mainly organized by the UVCA, which stands for Ukrainian Venture Capital Association. That's right. And in recent years, actually last year, we see a huge boom in ICOs, which no longer require funds, no longer require angel investors, seed investors, wherever. They just publish a website, put up the white paper, do good marketing, and they collect far more than any fund can give them. So my question is, what do you see in the future, especially Mark, you're heavily involved into this. Do you see that this market will shift towards pure ICO model, or there will be some collaboration between the traditional institutions who finance the startups and the ICOs, or ICO is just one-time thing and we'll forget about it next year?
I think, again, you should start a level on top. I mean, a bad entrepreneur doing an ICO is still a bad entrepreneur, and that's something a lot of people miss, honestly. I mean, I have quite a few friendly but not very successful entrepreneurial friends. They never really were able to have a success, and now they raise crazy sums just because they switched from a traditional funding model to the ICO model. So that's, I think, just one given fact that just that you have at the moment at least a quite easy way to raise crazy money in a short time doesn't make a project more successful. But let's say the foundation or the technology behind the ICO could really disrupt the whole industry. But I think we first have to wait. I always say I think 99.9 or 0.99% of the ICOs are just not really successful projects and people behind. So let's wait. So media can write about all the ICOs, that's just bullshit. But honestly, out of that, we will see a few successful cases. And I mean, personally, I also know quite a few also friendly but also successful entrepreneurs. And they realize it's really disrupting the way how they raise money. So that's why the technology will succeed. But what we see right now, I think that's not sustainable.
Yeah, anecdotally, I have a lot of friends who are lawyers who connect with us, and they're sort of sitting now patiently watching this all go on and preparing for years of legal work as a result of the ICOs. They're thinking it's great. I think Mark makes an excellent point. You really want to see the innovation that's been generated around ICOs professionalized, I think. You know, you have to, as Don said, make sure that you're doing the same checks you had to before for certain things. There might even be new things now where the technology is opening them up, and it does pose new risks, and you need new regulation. But I think in the long term, it is an innovation that does have a real value, and the quicker that we can start to sort through that stuff, the better the established industry and the emerging industry will be.
Yeah, what does it mean for venture capital? Well, I think it depends on the venture capitalists. Yeah, what do? They raise money and then they help companies, incubate them, give them advice, and so on. That second function will be as important or more important than ever. And the raising money, I think they can help in, they can be advisors and assistants in raising the money. And if you do that right, you can still take just as big a piece in the company. I mean, geez, Consensus Systems that'll help you do an ICO wants 50% of your company. Now it's going to be a successful ICO if they get involved, and a lot of really good entrepreneurs have decided that they'll go along with that. And on this thing about, you know, people say, well, come on, Don, all these ICOs, like most of them are garbage. Well, actually, a lot of them are going to fail, but 1 out of 10 traditional venture companies is successful. And this is 1995, you know, a lot of the dot-coms failed too, and people lost a lot of money as well. They say, well, come on, isn't there a lot of fraud? And it's like, well, I don't know of any personally, but there probably is, because criminals are always the first to adopt a new technology, you know, from the automobile to the cell phone. So I think that this overall needs to be viewed as a legitimate way of building entrepreneurship and supporting innovation in a country. And in the book, in Blockchain Revolution, I think the formulation was, we said, venture capital will be unrecognizable in 5 years. And we were wrong, because it's pretty much unrecognizable today. I mean, ICOs last year raised more money than all venture capital in the world. So if you're a government leader, if you're a venture capital, if you're a banker, if you're anybody, you have to wake up to this. And that is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the impact overall on the financial industry. You know, what does collaborative lending do to debt? What does a blockchain-based citizen identity do to that function of the financial system, which is authentication and achieving identities? Your credit score, your FICO score, you become your FICO score because it's in your identity, because it contains all your transactions. What happens to stock markets when people can do transactions peer-to-peer? What happens to the accounting industry when we have triple entry accounting and you have a real-time audit 24 hours a day? What happens to Ernst & Young's, you know, a third of their revenue at the end of the year? So these are changes that are coming very, very fast. And I remember back during the early days of the internet, somebody, I think it was Bill Gates, said, you know, I think we overestimate the impact of technology in the short term, and we underestimate it in the long term. I don't think that's true anymore. I think we're underestimating the impact in the short term too, because this thing is happening really, really fast. I mean, you just think about Davos. I don't know if any of you have been here. I'm going on a bit, but just yesterday I was interviewed by Wall Street Journal Television, and the journalist says to me, you know, this is the third year that I've interviewed about blockchain, and it seems that everybody is talking about blockchain at Davos. I don't know if you saw that factoid that somebody published. In the official program, the word blockchain is used more than the words Europe or the United States combined. So, so he says, but how's it changed over the years? And I thought about it and I said, well, 3 years ago, there were the only people talking about it was pretty much me, you know, and a tiny handful of other sort of people in the industry. Then last year, it got a lot broader. The central bankers started talking, ministers of finance, and we started getting this whole crypto and blockchain industry. And then this year, this is one of the great effects of this whole crazy explosion around crypto assets, that it's caused people to think not just about the asset, but about what's going on here in the underlying technology. And I think that that's at the heart of it. Can I say one more thing?
Sure, go for it.
The theme here is crypto assets. And, you know, in a lot of these interviews, people say, well, this is a bubble, right? This is the tulips in Holland. And sure, there's, I say, oh, yeah. And there's a lot of hype, isn't there? And I'm like, oh, there's a lot of hype. There's a lot of hype compared to where we're going. I mean, there was a lot of hype in 1995. We talk about the internet today more than we talked about in 1995. So the hype's not going to get smaller over the next decades. It's going to go up. And as for the, I'm sorry, what was I saying? The hype, the bubble. Well, think about this thought. The Internet of Information, thanks to Tim Berners-Lee, that was placed in the commons. And it's a public utility. But with the case of blockchain, the actual platforms and the protocols are going to be owned by investors. What's the Internet of Information worth? I mean, how many tens of trillions of dollars? If this one is bigger, this is probably the biggest investment opportunity ever in history. So the fact that we've got, what, a few $100 billion so far, I mean, there's a case to be made that that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the investments overall in crypto. Now, are a bunch of those going to fail? You bet. 10 years from now, the top 10 today, I'd be surprised if there are more than 2 of them left on that list. So as an investor, you have to be careful. But to say that this is all going to crash systemically, I don't think that's going to happen because we're just beginning.
Yeah, I think coming to your last comment, I think we're a little bit like in the pre-Google phase. So I remember there were hundreds of search engines, Hotbot, I don't remember all of them, but everybody was using one of these or several of these search engines. And then out of the blue, I remember Google came. I didn't like it in the beginning. Now I don't have any alternatives left. But I think in the whole crypto asset space, we're at the moment before Google. So I think we will see quite a few things happening. It's always difficult to say it publicly, but I could imagine that Bitcoin could become the MySpace of cryptocurrencies. I don't think that it's, I don't hope to insult anybody in the audience, but we will have quite a different landscape in a few years from now already.
I think of it more like email. Email was the first big app of the Internet of Information, and Bitcoin was the first big app of the Internet of Value. But now you have these general purpose platforms that look more like the web, where you can build anything, ultimately. Sorry.
But what's your take? All of you said that, I totally agree to that 99.9% of ICOs is total rubbish. I don't think they have any future. But from the government point of view, they're always worried about the people saying that if this will fail, well, I'm talking about my country right now. They're afraid that people will, gather around the national bank, asking to return their money, because the ICOs are not worth anything, and so on and so on. So what's your take on it? Should we, as a community, propose the rules of the game, or should we just wait for another half a year and wait for it to fail, and then say that this was wrong, let's propose the new rules now? So what's your take on it? What should we do? Propose rules now or wait for it to fail?
Well, first of all, you can have sensible rules now that are not draconian or stupid.
I'm not talking about regulation. I'm
Okay.
saying from the community point of view, because
Yeah.
as the Mark said, he's not the regulator.
Yeah.
He's
Okay.
the community.
So there's a very good report published by the World Economic Forum, and it was written by me and Alex, and it was about this question: how do we self-organize and govern this whole crypto blockchain world? And if you look at the Internet of Information, there are actually a whole bunch of different types of multi-stakeholder networks that govern the Internet. You have standards networks like the Internet Engineering Task Force and the W3C Consortium. There are advocacy networks like the Electronic Frontier Foundation. There are policy networks like the Internet Governance Forum. There are operational networks like ICANN that just deliver stuff. They deliver domain names. You have knowledge networks like, the Internet Society. There are network institutions, very complex, like the World Economic Forum, that are contributing to the self-organizing stewardship. It's not about government. It's about, as you're saying, governance. When it comes to the blockchain space, it's pretty much still the Wild West. And we desperately need to self-organize to start to build these structures. And people say, well, this is against the whole sort of libertarian, just let a million flowers bloom and so on. And a guy named Pindar Wong, who's a very smart guy in the whole crypto space, in a meeting that we were having discussing this, he said something quite profound. He says, just because it's decentralized doesn't mean it needs to be disorganized. And if we don't do this, some really bad things will happen. And so that report is a great report, and it provides a framework and an action plan on how to do it.
John, you want to add anything?
I think at a certain point, a lot of these things are going to bump into ethical questions. You talked before about how this Internet of Value is going to be privately owned, yet it's going to require the public sector and public support to enable that. So are we willing to give up, for example, our freedom of privacy so that, some the next Mark Zuckerberg of blockchain can create this wealth? I think there's some really big questions that opens up, and there's even further ones about the whole automation of information and how it's impacting our lives. So although this is a fascinating topic, I'm really looking forward to future WEF conferences to hear what comes and what other types of major innovations impact this discussion, because the world is changing everywhere, and blockchain is but one of those major revolutionary innovations.
Thank you. Well, I think it's time for questions from the audience. Well, I can continue asking questions for about another 3 hours. So if we have questions in the audience, it'll be time now, yeah. Please.
Hello, I'm a traditional investor, so this is my first presence in this kind of conference. Very simple question. There's all these ICOs you mentioned. As an investor that comes in, how do you choose between these companies? Somebody says, how do you choose between all these ICOs? What is as an investor, what are the parameters that you have to make the right
choose
choice?
Very carefully.
What is that? What does carefully mean? What do you look at? Is there anything you can look at?
Number one, ask them for their white paper, their technical white paper. If they don't have one, it's out. Then you get some people to carefully read it and see if it's bullshit, if it's feasible, if it's already been done before, if there's a real market for it, and all that kind of stuff. Well, you're venture capitalists. It's the same stuff. You look at their management team. Are they a bunch of hucksters, or are they people with some deep knowledge and background and expertise in this area?
Yeah, as I already said, it's exactly the same. It's just a different way how they raise money. I mean, the other opportunity or possibility, I mean, would be that you just invest in a fund which invests in ICOs, so it's exactly the same game. Yeah. Yeah. So you become an LP of an ICO fund at the end.
You probably also want to have somebody with a lot of the technical knowledge, going beyond the white paper and actually understanding how the system's going to work, because these things are vulnerable as well, and it's a new layer of due diligence that I think is oftentimes required.
Hello, my name is Ilya. I'm based in Zug. I'm developing a company in the art market that is getting ready for an ICO. So the question to everyone basically, what advice would you give to companies that are going for an ICO, how to avoid investors, particularly in the sense of money laundering issues?
Yeah.
And here comes regulation.
I do believe, this isn't really my expertise, Mark might know a bit more, but I do believe there are KYC providers, and a number of people would filter through that and use something like a traditional due diligence process on their investors.
Yeah, exactly. You have a few providers, they do everything for you, because I think that it's not your job as an entrepreneur to look into the investors and decide if it's proper money. So there you have providers and they do everything for you.
Well, the other thing is, what is your token? Is it a share in the company or an equity? Or is it some kind of utility? And if it's the former, you have to go through the whole thing. You might even want to do it to a limited number of accredited investors, you know. Every country has some rules around that, you know, you make at least $200,000 a year and you've got $1 million in assets or something like that.
I would just suggest look at the Telegram ICO, what they are doing. The pre-ICO and the actual ICO, how they're going to do it, they're going to change the rules.
Right, this is Zach from PundiX. So we just wrapped up our ICO like 2 days ago. And actually, in fact, when we were doing our ICO, we were also in Switzerland and had some good blessing from the community as well. So my question is that there are companies that are actually providing ICO services, right? Very professional companies. And as you have mentioned, some of them actually charge like 50% of the money raised, right? So if you look at traditional VC market, they are finder's fee, right? It's a reality. But if you look at a finder's fees perspective, is that kind of like fees worth it? Or what kind of services are these people providing that makes it like worth it or not? Yeah.
I mean, honestly, this is just working because you can raise so much more money that the 50%, at least at the moment, don't really matter. But on the long run, I mean, also from an ethical perspective, let's call it that way, I think there's absolutely no reason why you should do this. But it's, as you said, it's Wild West. I mean, now people which never invested in high feed funds, they just pay 5% management fee because they have the fear of missing out phenomenon. So it's a Wild West. I think in 2 years from now, we have a similar fee base like in all the existing traditional industries.
Yeah, the example of consensus systems is they want 50%, but it's not just to conduct the ICO. They will in perpetuity be your development shop. So that's a massive commitment that may well be worth 50%. And there's lots of super smart entrepreneurs that have signed up with consensus because they think it's worth it.
Please.
So I'm from Novum. I'm creating a Bloomberg of cryptocurrencies, and it's been started as a traditional startup. And to Don's point earlier, we're in the process of drafting our white paper, and which kind of advisors do you recommend are fundamental to get around you when you're doing that in the process, and to really do an ICO well? Sort of, is it the technical people? Is it the lawyers? Is it which experts should you be tapping first and doubling down?
I think both Mark and I have been on recent panels on ICO best practices, and I'm sure Don's talked about this as well. You hit two of the obvious ones, the technical expertise and the legal expertise. Would you add anything to that, Mark?
From my side, no.
Well, you also use the term advisors, which is something that's kind of different. So every day I get an email or two saying, we want you to be advisor. We're the next Ethereum, and we're going to give you 1 million tokens. And what they're really looking for is they just want some halo effect in my name. And I'm not really interested in doing that, so I reject like 99.9% of them. If it's a company that's really interesting, then I may get involved.
Yes, hello. Talking about the future, the solutions like Polkadot, where you have multiple blockchains interoperating and multiple tokens being exchanged. What do you see the future in the fact that the internet is one big network, but if you have multiple different blockchains and databases and multiple utility tokens, do you think it may create a mess down the road? Or what's your prediction on development of that aspect of technology?
Well, I have some thoughts. It's a bit of a mess right now. It's sort of like back to 1995, it's like the intranet. Everybody had their own little private intranets because we're not going to trust that public thing. But I think that we will see some public utilities emerging. There will be thousands of blockchains. But you've got really interesting projects underway that are sort of like the new platforms that enable interoperability of blockchains or cross-blockchain currencies. So something like Cosmos is about to come up. Uses Byzantine fault tolerance as its consensus mechanism. A couple of weeks ago, a project was announced called Metronome that's very interesting. It's a cross-blockchain currency. You have Aeon, based in Toronto, that's creating an internet of blockchains. Polkadot is another one. Icon in Korea. These are all really interesting platforms that are attempting to get integration. And not just that you can move one thing to the other, but if you get integration, that solves a scaling problem because you have all these multiple platforms that can be used for scaling, for doing high volume transactions.
Hi, my name is Neil Umbrer. I advise a number of ICOs in New York right now. And my question to you guys, given the panel topic, the next Sryptohaven, we've discussed Ukraine, we've discussed Canada. I mean, do you realistically think in Canada today is a great place to launch cryptocurrencies, aside from the technical expertise and the great developers? I'm Canadian, so I'm biased. But, regulatory reasons are driving a lot of the movement to parts of Switzerland and Singapore and other offshore jurisdictions. Where today are you?
Switzerland is not an offshore jurisdiction.
Well, other. I said other. So where today, like, are you telling people to launch?
I think we're all quite biased, right? I would say crypto nation Switzerland, and I think
Well, Canada's not the easiest place to do an ICO in the world right now. It may emerge as being the best place. Well, for all the reasons that I articulated, you've got this massive community. I mean, my son Alex gave a talk at a meetup in Toronto. And the first meetup, they had like 80 people. And this is a blockchain meetup. And the second one was like 220. And the third one was like 550 or something like that. So he wondered how many people. The night before the meetup, he went online. There was like 1,100 people registered, and he ended up, there was 1,300 people lined up coming out the door. There's this massive community of people who are really into this stuff. And the banks are investing billions. The federal government has $1 billion supercluster fund that's driving a lot of blockchain. Our Blockchain Research Institute, we have at the ministerial level support in the Bank of Canada, the federal government, the Ontario government. John Tory, the mayor of Toronto, came to our Blockchain Research Institute big summit, and he gave a great speech about blockchain, the freaking mayor of Toronto. And then he gave a speech on why everyone should move to Toronto, which, if you know John Tory, makes total sense. So there's all this massive incubation capability. there is a good environment for funding. And it's a good place to be. You know, it's a good country to be if you're going to live somewhere. So all of those, you know, I think the jury's out, really. China was a big contender until it shot itself in the head by banning ICOs, and now it may well ban Bitcoin exchanges and other things like that. And, you know, Korea had a lot going on too, but the government is screwing it up too. I was there recently, and I was meeting with the Office of the President. I did a bunch of media and so on, and I said to them, you know, when it comes to regulation, you have a patient on the table here. You want to have the most sophisticated microsurgery tools. You don't want to use a chainsaw on the patient because it's going to hurt your economy for decades ahead. So anyway, I'm going on.
Maybe to just add a short comment on that. I think coming back to some of the things we've said a few times, probably first when you're raising financing, you should be asking core business questions. You know, where am I operating? Where are my customers? Where are the things that are related to your business? And then on top of that, I think you ask yourself, where are capital markets? And traditional capital markets are in places like New York and London and Toronto. I think the trouble with that is there is a lot of regulatory uncertainty, and that's really what makes Switzerland such an attractive place and why there is so much attention centering here right now.
I'm also biased, but if you're not going into finance markets, then I would suggest Ukraine, because we have by far the largest community in Europe. We have the best developers in Europe, and it's really easy to raise capital, and trust me, all developers would love if you pay them in crypto in Ukraine. So, yeah, one more question, please.
Can I add to that? I think Ukraine is for sure is right. My name is Marc Andreessen, and excuse me. Sorry, my name is Marc Müller-Eberstein, and I work with I'm out of the state of Washington. I work with the governor there and figuring out how we make the state more crypto-friendly, and I'm very passionate about Dragon Chain, the Disney technology that creates the environment, and they are thinking right now where to put all the accelerators globally. Singapore, I think, is on the list, Ukraine probably as well. But where is the development challenge? I think they have 100 ICOs coming on their platform, but I think, what would you recommend in addition to the Ukraine?
Additional to Ukraine?
Yes.
Which other countries?
Come get me two more.
Two more? I'm very biased.
One thing that I'm very passionate about. Great point, and that's exactly what I was going to say. Is
Singapore already, but yes.
Yeah, but these are great examples. Switzerland, a lot we see because it's such a high-cost environment. The companies there naturally are a lot like blockchain companies. They're international from the beginning, and I think that's really a way of doing business that you have to get comfortable with. There's real advantages that you can leverage in the blockchain community in the Ukraine, and there's probably some other things you want to do in Toronto or Zurich. And if you can figure that out and you can use it to your advantage, I think you're going to be way ahead of traditional companies.
Yeah, and I think in general the whole world is becoming decentralized, so I rather know any blockchain-oriented company having all the people in one room. I even know companies where the founders never met in person and they still do a great job. So I think it's really changing. So you have perhaps the talent in Ukraine, the core team in Switzerland, and then some other people in Canada. So everybody's happy here, I guess.
International trade, great.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we're going to have to wrap up. So last question, please.
So hello,
Jan.
my name is Jan Keil. First of all, thank you very much for these high potential guests which are talking to us and really sharing interesting information. Before I ask the question, I would say with the word of Donald Trump, maybe blockchain can make Ukraine great again, right? First of all, like Michael already correctly said, we definitely have high potential talents in Ukraine, which drive money back to Ukraine, which helps to develop Ukraine. And secondly, blockchain can also help fighting corruption, and we actually see it, and we do it in Ukraine. Blockchain is definitely driving into the government because they have to show up that they changed something after the last 20 years. What my question is to Don. I'm not looking for an advisor, but I would be very interesting, especially from your side, but all of you, John, please also. You said 99.9% of the emails which are asking you for advice, becoming an advisor, you just regret. What is it that you are looking for? What do you find interesting?
Well, I'm looking for a company where the management team doesn't just want to make money, but where they want to do something consequential in the world. They want to solve a really big problem. So we're being videoed here. Next week, we're announcing that I'm going to become an advisor to a company that wants to reinvent the $64 trillion supply chain industry. And every time I meet with them, my head hurts about how smart they are and how purposeful they are, and what a big difference and change that they want to make in the world. Because a new supply chain could be a sustainable supply chain. It can be one where human rights are built into it, one with great transparency where we can address a whole bunch of problems in the world and so on. And then, I look for all the other stuff. Is the management the real deal? Do they have the technical expertise to pull this off? And that's pretty much it. I can't because it hasn't been announced yet. But if you go to the Google, it's on the internet, and you just ask the Google next week.
Yeah, and honestly, again, it's not different than in any other industry. I mean, for me, it's passion. I need passionate entrepreneurs, and it doesn't matter if it's about crypto or blockchain or whatever. It's about the people.
We still have the old way of how we assume whether an ICO is good or not. But I wanted to know what you are looking for if you are looking to blockchain. Is it platform? Is it dApps? Is it something in between?
So your personal interest. Oh. Don't explain.
Well, on that one, I have a big interest in the platform because I think that the Internet of Information is worth tens of trillions of dollars, and this new platform will be worth tens of trillions of dollars too. So anything that's transformational at the platform level, I'm all about.
Mark, John, please, your take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm deep into the cryptocurrencies because I think it's also changing society and economy, so that's what drives me mainly.
Yeah, for me, less about the technicality of it, more about the actual application. Is this a new type of platform that can actually have an impact and solve real things, have big challenges that it addresses? And yeah, those are few and far between, but when you find them, they're exceptionally exciting.
So I'd like to wrap it up, but before we finish, I'd like to take the opportunity, and I have a copy of your book down here, and it's in Russian.
I know, look at that weird thing on the front.
It's still not published in Ukrainian. I think we're going to fix that. But I'd love if you could sign, all of three of you, the book, and we're going to put it in the blockchain hub. It will be the first book which will be there. So please.
I have not seen that yet. It just came out. So thank you.